There are other issues, Madam Speaker, that have come to light about this bill since it was last debated in this place. And I'd like to speak on behalf of my constituents in Calgary-Nose Hill, particularly with regard to challenges in implementation of the bill that were raised in previous debates that the government did not address prior to implementation, that are now really coming to light. They're really made real, and they're impacting parents. So when this bill was last debated, many of my colleagues raised concerns that it could have a perverse outcome, that it could actually reduce the amount of childcare spots in the country, and we are starting to see that happen. At the end of January, there were several articles that came out after Alberta childcare facilities took part in rolling closures to protest the $10 a day program. And it's not that these facilities oppose affordable childcare. They oppose the fact that the government's implementation of this bill did not foresee or did not take into consideration the cost that they would have to absorb, making it unaffordable for them to deliver services to their clients, parents. So actually, the Association of Alberta Childcare Entrepreneurs said that the job action, the rolling closures, were meant to draw attention to issues that come with offering parents low-cost childcare without ensuring that the cost of delivery is still covered. It's been underfunded from the beginning, said Crystal Kircher, the chair of the Association of Alberta Childcare Entrepreneurs. There is not enough funding to ensure that the level of quality is going to be continuing on. So again, my concern at the front has been, and as I put on the record before, the Conservatives support access to affordable childcare. That's not in question. The way that the Liberal government has structured this program has become overly bureaucratic and has not adequately valued the labor of childcare in all of its forms. When I last spoke on this bill, Madam Speaker, I talked about the fact that the way that the bill is structured, the way that the funding mechanism is structured, it does not give access to parents who may work in the gig economy. They may have hours that aren't conventional 9-to-5 jobs. It does not provide for access to childcare for people in those situations in an adequate way. Also, people in rural communities are also having similar situations, and frankly, it also doesn't adequately value the labor of childcare provided by parents, grandparents, extended family members, neighbors who may pool childcare resources to take care of one another's children or grandchildren because of the lack of affordable childcare spaces in other ways. But that caregiving component, Madam Speaker, has no value on it under this Liberal government. We need to, if we are going to, in Canada, as a pluralism, a very diverse country, a very regionally diverse country, ethnically diverse country, economically diverse country, if we are going to maintain the unity of our pluralism, we can't set forward principles on childcare that don't universally value the labor of childcare provision equally. And this bill does not do that. And in spite of all the time that the Liberals have had to enhance these offerings, they've failed to do so. And to me, that speaks to a lack of creativity, a lack of innovation, and a worn-out government that has really overstayed its welcome. When I think about especially younger Canadians in my constituency, work for them looks a lot different than work looked for their parents or their grandparents. The reality is that somebody seeking a spot under the Liberals' current formula under this bill, if they're working shift work or in the gig economy, they're not going to have the same access to care that somebody who, let's say, is providing professional services, bankers, lawyers, that are working traditional 9-to-5 hours. And frankly, those people are also in position of privilege because they've usually had a different level of education. They may have access to networks that other people might not to get into these childcare facilities. And that doesn't speak to universality in in valuing the labor of childcare. And what I fear, Madam Speaker, is because the government has failed to correct these deficiencies in the way that the bill is currently outlined, that as we start measuring the outcomes of the spending over, let's say, a 2, 5, 10-year period, that we are going to see a big disparity, a big delta between, let's say, bankers and lawyers who have the networks to get into a childcare spot and work 9 to 5 hours versus people who are working multiple jobs in a gig economy and who are already having trouble making ends meet. So with that, I also want to talk about the fact, I did read through the debate on this amendment that happened earlier this week, and I noted that the minister talked about how she purported that this bill provided transparency to Canadians on outcomes, and it does nothing of that. I want to actually outline what the government must do this. The government, I'm going to put this on the record now because I know a future parliamentarian will want these figures. I bet the parliamentary budget officer will want these figures. The Auditor General may want these figures because we need to be able to manage value for money, right? The government has talked a lot about spending on this bill, but they're not talking about the opportunity cost of how this spending could perhaps have been used in a different structure to provide better universality of care for Canadian parents. So in terms of transparency, as a parliamentarian, there's data points that I cannot find. So for example, how many children are currently enrolled in a $10 a day spot in total and broken down by province or territory? It is impossible for parliamentarians to find out the number of children that have access to the spot and then measure it against the needs in a region, right? So if we're able to, if we want to be able as parliamentarians to measure the efficacy of this large amount of spending, then we should be able to have access to that data. The other concern that I have is that there is no data that's been provided on the average income of parents who have the $10 a day spot. The government has not put means testing in this bill, and I am concerned that these spots will be disproportionately going to higher income Canadians as opposed to lower income Canadians or Canadians that might be in the gig economy or in shift work. And the fact that the government isn't measuring this and isn't talking about this tells me that we are going to have a problem in the future. The other piece of data that we don't have is how many $10 a day spots are for flexible childcare outside of the hours between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. If the government wants to stand up and say that this bill will provide universal access to childcare, then again, as I said earlier, it should take into consideration all the forms of work and work arrangements that we see in Canada, which frankly, we're starting to see a major shift in economic modality in the country. You know, the days of, I still feel like there are many people in the public service who perhaps might be providing advice to the government who are saying, well, let's structure it around a 9 to 5 job because that is what they know. They know 9 to 5 hours. But the reality is outside of government, there are 9 to 5 hours are few and far between now, Madam Speaker. And even people who have 9 to 5 jobs, because of the inflationary crisis, are having to pick up second or even third jobs, right? We know a lot of people who might be working in a $40,000 or $50,000 a year traditional 9 to 5 office job, but then are driving Uber in the evening, Uber Eats, whatever. There are a lot of people who have side hustles who could have access to income and economic productivity who don't have access to childcare under this formula. The other key component that the government, I do not feel, is measuring adequately speaks to the problem in Alberta that I just mentioned. How many additional childcare workers are needed to achieve the amount of spots that the government promised would be created? So I have not seen the government provide any sort of analysis to show that there's an adequate plan in place to both train and retain childcare workers to provide the services that they've promised. There's a lot of money going into this bureaucracy and the creation of this bureaucracy, but if we don't have the labor to provide the services, then it's all for naught. And, Madam Speaker, I'd also point out if the government's not doing this analysis and not projecting forward on it, this problem is going to be compounded as we see an aging baby boomer population, and there are many people in my generation who are now feeling squeezed between parental care and child care, and in some cases grandchild care. So as we see more of a demand for care for seniors, we are subsequently going to see that's going to be competitive labor for child care. And the government needs to be measuring those statistics in order for Parliament to be able to determine whether or not this is an adequate or a right expenditure, because this is not a cheap program. Again, speaking to the concerns raised by childcare workers in Alberta, the government has not been transparent on the average wage of a childcare worker who provides $10 a day daycare. So again, why is this data necessary? Well, first of all, it's necessary to determine whether or not the government is considering fair wage in the context of $10 a day daycare provision, number one. Number two, it's needed to ensure that when we are looking at labor supply over a long period of time, that we have the data on what the wage, at least what the wage floor would be, so that cost and potential cost overruns or cost expansion of this problem or program could be adequately assessed. And provincial governments are going to need this data as well too. The last component too is that if we're seeing an average wage to fill these positions need to be much higher than what the government has forecasted, there's going to be, the government won't have adequately costed out the entirety of the program either, which also puts burden on provincial governments. The other components of data that the government haven't provided in their analysis or to Parliament, and I don't think they're measuring at all, are how many of the $10 a day spots are located in urban areas versus rural areas. I think that the government has, through many different policies, created more of a wedge between urban and rural Canada when they should be trying to knit these parts of the country together for national cohesiveness, for economic outcome, and just for social cohesion. So to create a disparity between availability of childcare in urban versus rural areas is wrong, and the government should be providing data to the public on whether or not that disparity exists, and if it does exist, how they plan to correct the program so that that delta doesn't get worse over the years. I also think that the fact that the government hasn't been forthcoming in the fact that it doesn't seem like they care about tracking this information. They didn't put any of this information forward in committee study. Their tone and tenor on the debate has been, this is the only way for the state to have a role in childcare in Canada, is fundamentally flawed. But the extent of that flawed nature can only be measured with this data. And Madam Speaker, I think that's why they are hiding it from Canadians. So I just want to take, for the record, extreme exception to the minister's comments that somehow this bill was providing transparency. It's a very Orwellian thing she said. None of this data is available to the public. Childcare, labor unions, childcare providers, and parents need to have this data to plan for the future. And I'll just close with this, Madam Speaker. We are going to see over the last several years, over the last 8 years, we've seen an unprecedented cost of living crisis in this country that has been exacerbated and made worse by the extreme level of deficit spending by the Liberal government. And in so many situations, we've just seen abject waste. $250 million to a company that has 2 employees, that has done no IT work, and is, in the basement of a cottage. How many other things like that have we seen? The We Charity scandal. There has just been so much waste with this government that any expenditures that the government is making now has to be evaluated with rigorous data against the outcomes of what the government is purporting the program to do. And my concern, based on what we've seen in Alberta, the lack of transparency on data, and the lack of principle of universality, is that The government cannot be making the inflationary crisis worse by putting forward expenditures that are not directly impacting in a positive way every person in this country. So that's why data is so important. And, you know, Madam Speaker, the government does have an obligation to parents to address the inflationary crisis. We can talk about childcare all we want, but the reality is childcare is one of many issues that Canadians are facing that they weren't facing 8 years ago. Out of control mortgage prices, out of control rent prices, you know, not even being able to buy a bag of groceries for less than $100. These are all things that make children unaffordable. And, you know, as we see global fertility rates, as we are going to need to ensure that we are incenting Canadians to have children and addressing a wide variety of issues around that, affordability writ large has to be a broader part of a bigger part of the conversation. So, Madam Speaker, again, I am dismayed that the government does not have better data on these outcomes. I'm dismayed that they have not addressed the concerns of childcare operators in my province. And I certainly hope that the government will be doing a better job of this so that future governments won't have to correct their mistakes that Canadians will have paid for. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Question.